A pleasure to me all at last. And, well, I had in fact come back from my viewing of The Wild Robot, and of course, I already made my review of it ever since it came out. So of course, today it is already Wednesday, but the thing is that we do have ourselves another film coming pretty soon, and just to fill in the time, I'm going to be going through another small series of films. But this series, of course, is a bit different than the likes of Sharknado. Rather than go into anything sci-fi related, we're going to, in fact, take a little direction into Colombia. Yeah, the same company that gave us such hits like Ghostbusters and Zombieland, they also were behind the Stuart Little trilogy. Yep. The old tale of an E.B. White book about a talking mouse who, in fact, forms a good family with the Littles in the state of New York. And the thing is that Colombia, in terms of their overall viewpoint and their overall final results of the film based on the novel, loosely based on the novel that is, they actually did a pretty good job in terms of giving us a nice big cast with a unique plot line and a very classical vibe. Something that we could probably never truly forget. Apart from other films that came out by this time, like Matilda, Dogma, Office Space, and even Deep Impact or Armageddon, it was the late 90s that truly were a unique point in history when the 20th century was coming to a close and an entire millennium of history had long been fulfilled. The thing is though, December of 99 came along and went along. I was 6 months old at that time, and by then, Stuart Little itself first sprung up in theaters. And while I never got to see it in theaters, it was years later, thanks to the usage of the VHS and the VCR that I had gotten a few years later, that I was able to, in fact, watch not only the first film, but eventually the sequel, plus the third film, which I would watch on DVD for the most part. In any case though, Stuart Little had gone on from VCR to DVD player, and then eventually internet web series, streaming platforms and whatnot. The thing is that Stuart Little has definitely transcended from various hard copies of media, hardware, software, etc., computers, tablets, smartphones, and various other gadgets. But all the history aside, Stuart Little is still something worth talking about today, after 25 long years. And just think, we got other movies that came out from that exact era that are also on the brink of being a quarter century old. Much like with myself, we definitely have lots to see and talk about. So without further ado, let's go ahead and talk a bit about the first movie, as well as the sequels, throughout the rest of the week, up until the release of the upcoming Joker Folie à Deux, which is of course going to be the sequel to Joker. Yeah, a mere 5 years since the first one came out. But anyways, Stuart Little, the Columbia film, of course, stars the likes of Michael J. Fox, Hugh Laurie, Gina Davis, Jonathan Lipnicki, as well as Steve Zahn and Nathan Lane. They all come together in this one classic piece. 25 years afterwards, I can confirm it's more than just worth watching. It's also worth looking back on, and it's also worth talking to other people on the basis of creating book-based adaptations. Because there's only so many examples nowadays that you can find that actually excel super well. Even though it was a real case back then, it was nothing like any other book adaptation. And there were others like it, like The Iron Giant, but even that was an entirely different story, which I had already covered once again. Stuart Little, of course, follows the young talking mouse, whom, of course, is centered in an orphanage in the state of New York. The film opens with a young boy known as George Little, excited that he finally gets to have himself a brother. He goes into his parents' room, the parents of which being Mr. and Mrs. Little, and they both are excited just as much as he is. And while George unfortunately has to go to school, with the likes of Frederick Little and Martha Little heading to the orphanage to find what child they should adopt to have as George's brother. He, after all, did tell him he wanted a little brother and not a big one. But of course, after some skimming and some advice from one of the personnel aboard inside the orphanage, well, they do eventually come across a choice of theirs. A young mouse whom was unlike any other child that was inside the orphanage at the time. The mouse's name was Stuart, and while he was reading books, finding his way around the building, and of course, situating the littles to ensure that they are in a good place with plenty of nice options in mind and all the various talents that these kids have. Both Martha and Frederick agree to have Stuart Little as their second child. A talking mouse. Yeah, there was nothing like it at the time. Just think, with the idea of a talking mouse today, you could probably only go so far. But it was through Columbia's own movie Magic in 1999 that truly showed that you could do so much more than just have an animal that's more human than many others. So of course, when Stuart is brought back home, he is not only introduced to the likes of George Little in the form of a picture of him in the house since he wasn't home yet, but he also got to know about various other relatives of the Little family themselves. Edgar, Spencer, Beatrice, Estelle, and many others. But of course, when George himself finally does arrive, there was one little problem. The Littles, of course, had one other member of the house, known as Snowbell, a white cat, who basically sees George as a little snack. Obviously, he gets scolded, and oh boy, they really have set up a hardcore rule for him. You don't eat Stuart Little, otherwise out you go, Mr. Snow. And when George does come home and finally see Stuart, recovering from his little entryway into Snowbell's mouth, he unfortunately doesn't quite get as happy as he could have been. That night, though, during dinner, some things about Stuart are exchanged between the Little family themselves. Apart from some compliments of the meatloaf that Martha made, George, of course, does give Stuart a bit of a question. Can you pass the gravy? Obviously, this was a bit out of Stuart's league. I mean, a huge pot of gravy, which would have been nothing to us people, but for someone of his size, it would have been a challenge. Nevertheless, though, they do try to make things work out, but the following morning doesn't unfortunately get much better. You see, because even though Stuart and George woke up in unison in an effort to get to school, Stuart unfortunately becomes the entanglement of George's nightwear and ends up getting tossed in the washing machine by accident. Yeah, Martha didn't even hear or see him until the very last second after some little exchanges went down between Stuart and Snowbell and some failed attempts to try and get out of there because he was locked in that thing. Nevertheless, though, when Martha finally catches sight of him inside the washer with the water fully immersing him, she thankfully saves him just in time. And even though the detergent had mixed, the water had gone into him, a doctor came by and checked up on him and found out he was A-OK, apart from some slight cold, which was actually a bit of a reference in the book where this cold actually would turn to bronchitis. Yeah, I remembered reading the book many different times. There's very little details that were in the book's plot that matches up with the movie's plot, but being that both are decades apart from each other, kind of like how we've had other media from books like Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory and The Wizard of Oz, or The Goldfinch, for instance. There's a lot of different things that they try to make different in the films just to make things more believable. But if you ask me, Ready Player One and The Martian, more recent novels, have shown us that you could do way better by following more of the source material from the book themselves. And in this instance, though, that's probably one thing that I don't quite appreciate here. That there's not that much to take away from the novel that they put together into the film. But at least they did leave some loose references from the book just for us to get to know about. The part where Stuart catches a cold apparently came from him being inside the washing machine by accident and ingesting some detergent in the process. The cold of which would turn to bronchitis, but even then, Stuart would recover from his little trouble in the washing machine, and the Littles decided to take a little shopping spree, basically. Out in the city, they visit a local store, an outlet in particular, where they would browse various outfits that would match more of Stuart's size. And after some much needed thinking and some research from the clerk, Stuart would eventually find a good outfit, one that surprises himself, but more from his parents. They hardly recognize him. Therefore, he looks just like a Little should be. And so, that's the thing with the Little family themselves. They have a lot more of the formality in them when it comes to dressing, but they still do have some regard for the more casual wear, kind of like what most of us will have today. However, some more things go wrong with them. Because we know that Stuart does try his best to get along with some of the others in his life, and even though some other things do take place, the thing is, between Stuart and Snowbell, they don't really get along all too well. Snowbell still does believe that he should belong in a hole and in a much more appropriate place for a mouse. So it's that kind of stereotype that he basically implicates onto him, almost in the form of an insult. But Stuart still does take all these things as more of a necessary ways of creating an attachment with him. And while Snowbell seems to be the most challenging to get along with, the thing is, we eventually get to see more of George and Stuart. And think about it for a minute. George was the one who wanted a brother in the first place. So it eventually would make sense that after some unnecessary chasing going along with Stuart and Snowbell, that Stuart would end up in the room of George Little himself, which is in the basement for some reason. Yeah, this room of his, apart from his bedroom, which is on the top floor, basically is a pretty loaded area. I mean, he has a model of an Old West township, which is a bit of a reference to when Michael J. Fox was in Back to the Future Part 3. And that whole thing alone does give me a lot of vibes to Back to the Future. But the real awesome stuff starts coming through when Stuart and George try to bond with each other while in the room. Stuart plays helpless damsel on the train tracks, basically untying himself with his own tail at the last second, and that does make George laugh pretty well. Eventually, he encourages Stuart to check out another one of his prized possessions, a remote-controlled car, which is basically a 1940s convertible roadster. Stuart gets inside, realizing this is one of the very few things that seems to be fitting for his own stature. And by adjusting the mirror, he sees yet another thing behind him. A boat called the Wasp. The thing is, earlier in the movie there was a bit of a thing where George was not so content on entering a certain boat race that was happening in Central Park. However, the project that he and his father started, Frederick Little, had unfortunately been postponed and eventually just ended altogether because he was not confident about entering the race, knowing that he could end up finishing last. But thanks to some helpful tips from Stuart and some encouragement, they do try to get back to work on it in the hopes that they can enter the next boat race, of which they managed to do so. Meanwhile, Snowbell is up there after that little trouble he had with the likes of his friend Monty and Stuart. He and Monty eventually go into the alley and deal with another cat named Smokey, played by Chaz Luitpitani. And the thing is that they have a bit of an exchange where the alley cats of New York basically are hoping to find some food while at the same time trying to avert a so-called crisis. And in this case, this is pretty much what it is. They make a plan to kill Stuart later on. The next morning, though, is when the legendary boat race of Central Park takes place, and even though the Wasp was A-OK and ready to go, Stuart and George still do have some trouble trying to get it together. mainly with Stuart trying to handle the remote, of which he accidentally slips, and a man steps on it, causing it to shatter. It ends up in little pieces, making George upset. They eventually try to settle things out, but right then and there, the race commences, and the Littles feel the need to just forget about the whole thing and go home. But they forgot one thing. Stuart was apparently in control of the boat, and how he managed to do it is pretty much beyond me. But nonetheless, Stuart was racing in a boat. Could you ever get any more awesome than that? And it's not just any boat, it's the Wasp. Basically, an Age of Sail style boat that is out there and kicking some serious butt. Even though there was basically a rival to George Little, whom apparently was stocked with his own professional and custom-made boat that was basically cheating left and right. Various other boats in the competition were completely decimated in his path. And I kid you not, this guy was a total bully. The Littles hated him, especially Frederick. But wouldn't you know that there was eventually a point where George tackles him? Yeah, and even though Frederick hates this guy, he still basically pulls George out of there. Yeah, that's one thing many people didn't understand at the time. Why would Frederick hate this boy, even though George attacks him and whatnot? I guess it's probably because of the belief that violence is never the answer, but in any case though, after a bit of a struggle goes down, the Wasp does manage to gain the upper hand and win the race. Not only did the Littles earn a nice big trophy, but they also get an amazing welcoming committee from the likes of the rest of the Littles themselves. Yeah. Basically, earlier in the film, we had the Littles that came in and brought a bunch of presents for Stuart, but now they return to the Little house to congratulate him on his epic victory of the Central Park boat race. They come together for a nice family picture, but eventually there's a knock on the door. And apparently, 2 other mice have entered the household. And it's none other than the Stouts. Yep. Stuart's parents. This was a pretty shocking turn of events. I mean, even though Stuart was knowingly adopted by the Littles family and other people of which sorts, apparently these biological parents of his just decided to come back into his life and let him know about what had happened. Supposedly, Stuart was a bit of a pain for them, and it was a very difficult choice to make for them to have to give him up to an orphanage. However, supposedly things actually got better for them because they were able to make a nice new family abode on a golf course, the 18th hole with a castle, where they sit on the top floor, overlooking a majority of New York itself. They basically not only take Stuart back, but it does kind of upset the rest of the family. Especially George. He himself was already in a lot of trouble with Stuart. Not really because he got into any fights with him or anything like that, but because he had a really hard time adjusting to the fact that Stuart was a mouse, and now that Stuart had actual parents that were of his own species, that really made things even worse for him. So George definitely felt like it was a worthless, hopeless situation. However, he does come out at the last second to basically hand Stuart one of his own possessions. The Roadster. Yep, that same car that he allowed Stuart to hop inside of earlier in the film. He's now giving it away to him as is basically his own little goodbye token, in the hopes that Stuart could live a better life with his own parents. And so, it's basically just that. It's quite a sad way to put things together. I mean, old parents of Stuart gave him up to an orphanage just to have another family adopt him, and now they take him back. Of all places they could have gone to, it was a golf course. But here's where it really becomes troublesome. Basically, some more dialogue between the cats is put together, and eventually we're cut to the exact moment where inside of the castle of the golf course where Stuart is apparently trying to get some rest, Unfortunately, his parents, basically, both the Stouts, end up getting into some guilt. Yeah. And they're forced to tell him the secret. They kidnapped him. And not only that, but they were basically being used by the Alley Cats as some sort of scapegoat. Just to feed Stuart to them in the middle of the park. On a golf course. I mean, that is scary. But Stuart thinks it is brilliant. It was a good piece of self-actualization for him to come to realize that he is not a Stout. He is actually a Little. And he gets so worked up about it that he just yells it out loud. However, he's told to run. He would go home, but it's dark outside, the cats are looking for him, and he could end up lost, as New York is a huge city, one of the biggest in the entire world. But as we come to remember, every Little in the world can find the little house. Stuart becomes confident enough to drive back home, and even though he gives a good amount of effort to find his way out to civilization, away from the park itself, he still unfortunately crosses paths with the cats. After a vigorous chase scene goes down, he ends up getting lost in the sewers. The car flies out, and a piece of luggage of his is the only way he's able to keep afloat. But things start to take a turn for the worse when he realizes he's entering a waterfall that'll take him deeper into the underground sewage system. Thankfully though, he was able to get out of that and make himself back up to the surface. Coincidentally, right in front of the little house itself. So he goes right through, enters the door via the mail slot, and unfortunately nobody is there to visit. And that's because the Littles themselves realized that the Stouts were in fact kidnappers of Stuart Little himself. They create missing posters using an old photo that they had taken of him, and they proceed to go all over the state of New York in the hopes that the entirety of the city will eventually come to find Stuart and bring him back home. So, of course we do ought to mention that one of the detectives that shows up at the Little's house is none other than Bob Hoskins. Yep. That same decade where we got along such big hits out there. Bob Hoskins shows up in this film, mostly as a guest star, but still does a nice job as a detective nonetheless. In any case though, while the Littles are still out there, Stuart does enter the house, but unfortunately Snowbell is the only face that he gets to see. Even worse, Snowbell decides to show him a little surprise in the form of a picture. The same picture that they took on the day that they won the boat race. And Stuart's face is cut out of it. Yeah, it's that old tradition where if you don't like somebody or you want somebody out of your life, basically former family or ex-family, should we say, you cut out their photos, or at least crop their parts from photos that you like. And so, Stuart basically just thought that the Littles hated him and proceeds to head back outside and go up inside a tree inside a bird's nest. Snowbell eventually follows him, knowing that he feels just as guilty as others have felt. He explains to Stuart that he lied to him because he was pretty jealous, and also because he didn't realize that Stuart was that valuable. He knows that Stuart is an important part of the family. He was the reason why that boat race was won. He was the reason why a lot of things changed for the Little family themselves, especially George, whom was already not so good about himself. And so, once that news breaks out to him, Stuart does, in fact, feel more like he should head back to the house itself. However, there is this one problem left to deal with. The cats. They come back for him. They try to go up to him, climb up the trees and whatnot, but eventually they all settle on a branch in which that Snowbell eventually breaks off, and they fall into the water down below. All, however, one still remains. Smokey. Yep. Chaz's own character in the Stuart Little series. And Smokey himself also gets defeated by being whacked in the face with a branch this time by Stuart, after a little name correction took place, to certify that Snowbell and Stuart are family, and they will work together to defeat these ferocious feline fiends. And with that in mind, with all the cats defeated and all of them out of the picture, Stuart and Snowbell proceed to head back home. And when they do, one little glimpse through the window as George is being carried off to bed suddenly causes Stuart to be brought back inside through the window. Snowbell also gets brought back in. And right then and there, that's how you have a happy ending. There's a good majority of different things in the soundtrack, but the best part is during the credits, where we get some funny scenes, some blooper works, and a bit of a montage between some bonding time with George and Stuart. Set to Lou Bega's 1 + 1 is 2. Yeah, this was one of the reasons why I'm a fan of Lou Bega's mambo stuff. Yeah, lots of singers from the late 90s came along to work on this soundtrack, and he was one of them. All in all, this was a fantastic film that had come around. And with all things considered, we definitely have lots to talk about regarding Stuart Little. There, of course, were 2 movies that came along after this in 2002 and 2005, along with an animated series, which I might save for the next time I do TV shows that deserve the spotlight. However, though, for the first film, I'm going to give it a nice scoring of 8.7 out of 10.1. So, not entirely an amazing film because it has left out some material that came out of the novel, but that's pretty much a common occurrence with some movie adaptations based off of books. And with all things considered, I hope you enjoyed this piece, and I will be back soon with some more of this stuff.
Whatever I want, I usually get, and I'm thinking I want you.